Ashkechan kerem, we find the requirement to say a bracha before we eat by the fruits of a vineyard. And we learn this from Kerem Revai, which is the 4th year of a vineyard, which is the first 3 years. It was forbidden. It was called Arla. And the 4th year needs to be taken to Yerushalayim, or it could be redeemed, and the money taken to Yerushalayim. And it says it's Hilulim, it's praises. And from that we learned that we need to say brachas before we eat, but that was only for vineyards, which its produce was brought to Yerushalayim. Shar, minin, minayin. How do we know other types of food? Shar is other, and minin is types. Other types. And I want to make a difference between minin and minayin. Minayin means from where. It's going to be hard for me to fit that in there. So the answer is the Yalef mi Kerem. We're going to learn it from Kerem. That means we're going to use a mamatzino. A mamatzino is just as, which means just as we see here that you need to say a bracha, so too over there. And the Gemara spells it out. Ma Kerem, just as a vineyard. Davar shenana is something that is enjoyable. Nana gives pleasure. B'ta'on bracha, and it requires a blessing. Af kol davar shenana, also anything. Kol davar, anything. And af is also anything. Shenana, that gives pleasure, that's enjoyable. Ta'on bracha will require a blessing. So the Gemara asks a question on this, and the question is going to be that you can't say just as this. In our case, just as a vineyard requires a bracha, so too everything else. If there could be a problem, if the vineyard is unique and has a specific halacha, and I could possibly say that maybe that's the reason why it requires blessings, but anything else that does not have that uniqueness does not require blessings. So, Ika lemifrach, there is to ask, Ma lekerem, whereas for kerem, now we translated ma, kerem, on the top here, just as. Let's do just as. We put it on the side. Usually ma means what? And here, it's really whereas, ma lekerem, but to keep it simple, we'll have it for just as well. Ma lekerem, just as for a vineyard, shekain chayev, which is chayev, obligated. But oilulos are normally a grapevine, has clusters attached to it. And the way the clusters work is that they get smaller and smaller as it goes down. Normally, it does not have that little blotch sticking out over there. Let's just extend it to make it a normal grape cluster. It has shoulders. This is called shoulders up here, kasef. And it also has a natef, which is the tip on the bottom. But if you would have, instead of having the shoulders, it would just be grapes coming down like this. And it doesn't really have the shoulders. That's oilus. These oilus need to be left for the poor. They need to be left for the poor. So, because it has a unique halacha, there's a halacha of oilus. So therefore, maybe that's the reason why it's required. The bracha is required. But anything else that doesn't have oilus, it doesn't require a bracha. Maybe that uniqueness is what gives it the obligation that you need to say brachas on it. The Gemara says that can't be, because kama is standing grain. It means standing, but it means grain. Standing grain. Techiach will prove. And standing grain, I know that I need to say a bracha on wheat, because it says v'chalta v'savata v'rachta, that you should bench after you eat. And okay, if I have to bench, then kal v'chomer, we learned before, I have to say a bracha beforehand. And that's going to prove. How is that going to prove? Because I don't have oilus by standing grain. And nevertheless, I'm required to say a bracha. So it must be that it's not the oilus that requires the bracha. Kama proves that I need to say brachas, even though I don't have, even though it's not obligated in oilus. So I am going to learn it from kama. Kama, I need to say brachas, but I'm not really learning it from kama yet. I'm just saying that the kama disproves the oilus theory. I'm learning it from kerem, and I had a question on it. Well, kama says that that's not a question. The Gemara now asks, Mala kama, whereas for kama, or just as kama, which means standing grain, shekain chayeves bechala, that has its own halacha, which may be the reason why I need to say a bracha on bread and on wheat, is because it has a unique, specific law of challah. And maybe it's challah that requires the blessing. But anything else that does not have challah will not require the blessing. So the Gemara says that's not a question, because kerem yechiach, because the vineyard does not have challah, and it requires a blessing. So v'chazar hadin. There's two ways of reading this, but I would like to say v'chazar hadin, that we have now resolved and revolved. We take back the law, which is our original ma'amatzino, and the way we're going to take it back is not with a ma'amatzino like we wrote here, but rather with a tzad hashava. That's supposed to be above. Tzad hashava. A tzad hashava is a common factor between two things, and it goes like this: Loi re'izeh k're'izeh, the strength of this, or the case of this, we translate in class as the case. This case, k're'izeh, is not like this case. V'loi re'izeh, in this case, is not k're'izeh, like this case, which means kama is not like kerem, and kerem is not like kama, because each one has oileless, or chala, and not oileless. But hatzad hashava shebehem, but the common factor between them is davar shenena. It is something that is enjoyable, v'ta'un bracha, and it requires a bracha. That means both kerem and kama are enjoyable, and they require a blessing before you eat. Af kol davar shenena, also anything that's enjoyable. Af, also kol davar shenena, anything that's enjoyable. Ta'un bracha would require a blessing. Let's go a drop further. The Gemara now asks a question. Mala tzad hashava shebehem, whereas for the tzad hashava, for the common factor between them, which is kerem and kama, which is a vineyard, and grain, shekain, that there is, shekain, that there is, yes, yesh boy, there is in it, tzad mizbeach, an association with the altar. That means wheat and grapes or wine is put on the altar, wheat as in carbon mincha, and wine which is poured, the nesachim. So when I have a ma'amatzino, I said I can only include things that would have the same law as it. So for example, kerem, I could only include things that would have oilless. Kama would only include things that have challah, which was basically nothing. So when I have a tzad hashava, I have a similar issue, that the tzad hashava will only include things that has its unique law. So the tzad hashava is now a ma'amatzino from two things. So I have a kerem and a kama. So what's common between kerem and kama is that both of them have an association with the mizbeach. So the Gemara says, the Gemara's question is that, well, you're basically going to include nothing, because what else has an association with the mizbeach? Now, Zalmi kept asking that, what about meat? I don't have an answer for that. But anyway, the Gemara says I would only include things that have a association with the mizbeach. V'asi, and it will bring nami also zayas. It will also bring a olive. De'is bei tzad mizbeach, that an olive has an association with the altar, which is when I put the flour on the mizbeach, it was mixed with oil, and oil is olives. So the Gemara now gets sidetracked, and the Gemara says, I'll put this in brackets, V'zayis mitzad mizbeach asi, you're going to include an olive because it has an association with the altar. So in other words, kerem and kama is only going to include one thing, and it's going to be oil. Or let's put that in Hebrew. Zayas. It's going to include a zayas. Why? Because all three have an association with the mizbeach. The Gemara says, I need the mizbeach to include it through the tzad hashava. V'habehedya, but clearly, let me make that as a comma. V'habehedya ksiv bei, it's written by it, kerem. It says kerem. Zayas says kerem. So wherever I learned kerem from, I'm also going to learn olives. Wherever I learned vineyards, I'm also going to learn olives. The ksiv, where does it say, where does it call olives a vineyard? The ksiv, as it's written, vayivar, and it destroyed, migadish vi'ad kama. This is Shimshon lit the fox's tails, and he let them run around the Philistines' fields. And from Gadish is the piled grains, and Kama is the standing grains. The Ad, Kerem Zayas, and it destroyed also the olive groves or olive yards. So we see that Zayas is called a Kerem. Now, we learned that Kerem requires a bracha from Kerem Revai. And Kerem Revai had a Gzeira Shava where it says Tavua, Tavua, and Tuas HaKerem. So if it says Kerem as part of the Gzeira Shava, then anything that's Kerem would be included, and it would include Zayas. So our question is, why do I need Eitzad Shava to include Zayas, olives, oil? I know it from the word Kerem from that earlier Gzeira Shava. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa answers. Rav Papa is one of the later Amiram. He's a student of Abai and Rava. Kerem, a vineyard. No, that's wrong. You don't read it like that. This is how you read it. Kerem, very important how this is read. Kerem Zayas Ikri. It's called a Kerem Zayas. Kerem Stama, plain Kerem, Loi Ikri. It's not called. Kerem Stama would be simple, which means without a secondary title. Kerem Stama, it's not called. So in other words, I got to put a end of brackets here. In summary, we try to learn from a Tzad Hashava between Kerem and Kama, and that would include olive oil. We asked on that, but olive oil we know from other sources. We said that from other sources we would not know that. What are we left with? You're going to see the next Gemara that we're still going to have our original question, that we're not going to be able to learn everything from that Tzad Hashava. It's going to say Mikol Makom Kasha.